This week, as the United States celebrates 250 years since its founding, we here at The Global Story have been marking the moment too, with a very special series exploring the surprising and often hidden ways that the United States has shaped the modern world.
And today we hear from you.
In collaboration with the Global News Podcast, we answer your questions about how America has shaped the world.
From the BBC, I'm Tristan Redman in London.
And I'm Asma in Washington, D.C. And welcome to The Global Story on YouTube.
Well, I'm pleased to say that today we're doing something a little bit different here on The Global Story. Normally, and regular listeners know this, we do a deep dive on one story every single day. And along with our sister podcast, the Global News Podcast, where you can go for the latest news headlines every single day, twice a day. We are teaming up today at the end of our special week of episodes on America's 250th anniversary. We're doing a collab with our friends over at the Global News Podcast to answer questions from our combined audiences. And I'm pleased to say that we have some Global News Podcast input here with us today in the studio.
Celia Hatton,
Hello.
welcome back to the show.
Thank you very
Celia,
much.
I will say, regular listeners of the Global Story podcast will, of course, have heard you. You've been a guest on our show. And, of course, listeners of the Global News podcast, the show that you host, will know you. But for anyone who may be a new listener, could we have you just introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about what you do in your specific area of expertise.
Sure. So my reporting background lies in China. I was a correspondent there inside China for 15 years, the last few years with the BBC. And then I had 10 years being a regional editor, focusing on Asia Pacific for the BBC here in London before I became a full-time presenter. I should say, too, that I'm Canadian. So I'm sure you'll be hearing that a little bit today, because it definitely kind of factors into my thinking about the U.S. 250th anniversary. Yeah.
Wonderful to have you with us.
Well, I'm also pleased to say we're joined by BBC's international editor, Jeremy Bowen. But for listeners who are joining us for the first time, Jeremy, how would you introduce yourself?
Well, I've been a BBC journalist now for my entire working life, which is 42 years. And I've been most of that time a foreign correspondent. So I suppose I'd introduce myself by saying I have had a hand in the reporting of most of the major world stories since the late 1980s. And as for America, well, I have worked in Washington, but I've also studied in Washington.
And Jeremy, is it accurate that you've reported from more than 90 countries? That's the folklore I hear around here at the BBC.
Well, yeah, if you actually average that out per year, it's not very many.
I mean, it's still impressive to me. So welcome back to the show.
Let's drive straight in with some questions then. We have one from our listener, John, in Texas. And here's what John has to say.
Hi, this is John Malee from Houston, Texas. I suggest you contrast how the outside world views the USA today versus in the 2 decades following World War II. The changes have been radical.
Jeremy, over the course of our lifetimes, how has the way the United States is perceived around the world changed?
Well, it's interesting that the question was about the 2 decades, and I suppose that those 2 decades, 1945 to 1965, were in a sense the era of American ascendancy in so many things, because they emerged from the Second World War, unlike their European allies, not just with their industrial base intact, it was enhanced. They came out with all industrial guns blazing, and where, poor old Britain, where we're sitting, was bankrupt. America was booming. And it was certainly a time when America's prestige was high, when people in Europe really admired what the Americans had achieved. There was, of course, as well, Marshall Aid, the Marshall Plan, which helped rebuild Europe after the destruction of the Second World War. But America had become a world power in the Second World War, and they continued to use that power after the Second World War. They didn't go back to the isolation that they'd had previously, right back to the foundation of the Republic 250 years ago, when George Washington, in fact, I think it was his farewell address as president, he warned against entangling alliances. So I think if you were sitting in somewhere in West Germany where the Americans were pouring in money, rebuilding industry, America probably looked pretty good. And, you know, you're drinking Coca-Cola and maybe trying your first burger or something like that. But if you were in Iran in 1953, when the British and the Americans unseated a pretty much democratically elected president, or if you were in Guatemala or other parts of Latin America where America was putting its interests first, second, third, and fourth, that really was America first, then you would have different views. And of course, by 1965, that was after the assassination of Kennedy, America was getting very involved in Vietnam, and President Johnson, his successor, escalated that. So after 65, that's when, you know, America, the very flawed world power, killing loads of people abroad in the interests of, anti-communism or whatever reason they were giving at the time. And of course, with turmoil at home by the 1960s, because civil rights movement, assassinations. So yeah, I mean, on some levels, America was probably at its apogee in those years of 45 to 65, but the seeds of what you might say they've become were always very much there. Maybe it goes with the territory if you are the global hegemon.
When you travel around the world now to various different conflict zones, do people speak differently about the United States to how they used to, or is it much the same?
Oh, it's things so much has changed. I mean, never mind traveling around the world. You just walk out of this building in central London, you'll find people whose perceptions of the United States, British people, have changed massively in the years of Donald Trump. Of course they have. The US is not seen by many people in this country anymore as an ally. But I think over the years, for me personally, I have to say, being exposed to, in a way, the American dream, a sense of possibility and optimism that certainly for the privileged people I was mixing with in Washington, D.C., was absolutely nothing. We had nothing of the sort in this country. For me, going to the United States in the early 1980s broadened my horizons enormously and gave me a sense of what might be possible in life that I don't think I would have had I stayed in grimy old Britain, which in the early 1980s was not a very happy place.
Let me take us on to our next question. We have talked a lot on our show, and Celia, I'm sure you all have as well on the Global News podcast, about the changing world order and how the United States, in this second Trump term, is taking a more isolationist approach to foreign policy. And we have a message here from Sonia in Canada. Let's take a listen.
Hi, Asma and Tristan. This is Sonia from Canada. As a close neighbor to the States, the last 10 years or so has been really interesting and somewhat concerning to observe. What has contributed to the U.S. becoming more insular and isolationist in recent years? How is this more isolationist path going to shape the country in the years to come? In what ways could the U.S. become stronger or weaker?
I feel that we must go first to your fellow Canadian, Sonia, and that is Celia Hatton. From your perspective, how do you see the wider impact of an isolationist United States?
Asma, it's a good question. And I kind of have to go back to something that Jeremy said a few moments ago. He was talking about how in the past, you know, the United States was seen by many countries as a strategic ally, that the United States was there. And it's interesting listening to Sonia ask these questions about why the United States has become more isolationist. You know, when I think about Canada and the reactions of Canadians to Donald Trump coming into the White House for a second term, all of those pronouncements sort of crouched as jokes that Canada was going to become the 51st state. I still remember the real fear almost that kind of rippled through Canada. And it wasn't just that Donald Trump said it once or twice. It kept coming up again and again in his Truth Social comments. He would say it on camera. He said it to Justin Trudeau, the then Prime Minister. And so
Governor Trudeau.
Exactly. Governor Trudeau. He didn't even give him the title. And so I think that I remember that summer, just after Donald Trump had come back into into office, I went home for my annual summer trip back to Canada, and I walked into a grocery store called Piconi's, which is a famous grocery store where I'm from. And like many stores in Canada, it had been completely overhauled so that every single item in the store that was made in Canada was front and center. You could not ignore it. There were Canadian flags plastered all over the store. And really, the entire store had been reworked to become an advertisement for Canadian products. And
That's
it was just
fascinating. So you're almost suggesting that the United States isolationist approach is pushing its neighbor to the north to adopt a somewhat similar, I don't want to extrapolate on that, but a somewhat similar approach, at least when it comes to economics.
So this kind of attitude is almost contagious, this kind of feeling that you need to kind of put up the hatches and kind of just support your own. I think just emotionally, things have really changed with this isolationist bent. And I think Sonia's right. It's right to kind of focus in on it, because that's been a major change that has happened in the United States. And it's had huge effects elsewhere.
Well, all of this is contributing to the idea that an old world order is coming to an end. There's been a lot of debate about that over the last few months. We have a question on this tack from our listener Swarit in India, and this is what he'd like to know.
Hi, I'm Swarit from India. As the USA celebrates 250 years of independence and seeks to shape the international order for the decades ahead, where does India fit into that vision? And can India deepen cooperation with Washington while preserving the strategic autonomy that has traditionally defined its relationship with Russia, Iran, and the wider global south? I would love to hear what you guys have to say about it. Thanks.
Jeremy, why don't we start with you?
Well, I would say that actually, in a sense, the rise of India is part of America's decline, that there are other large powers that are rising. You look at India, it's got an growing and very highly educated middle class. It's got a very large population. It's got all sorts of attributes, which in the next 50 odd years will be, I think they will be, as a rising power, one of the countries which America will have to deal with.
Can I just a follow up here? My sense for the last couple of administrations here in the United States, you can go back to George W. Bush. There was a systematic effort in the United States amongst Republicans and Democrats to court India to balance out the influence of China in the region. And what I've been struck by in this term is that we don't see that deliberate effort anymore, which makes me wonder where India fits into the equation. I mean, I heard President Trump refer to India, his words, a big tariff abuser. He slapped really significant tariffs on India. I guess my question is just, is it possible in this moment, when we talk about a shifting world order, to be a country that is, as we say, as we've heard Mark Carney of Canada say, a middle power that isn't really aligned with the United States or with China directly?
Do you remember after the Ukraine invasion, India was under real pressure to say where it stood? Was it on Russia's side? Was it on Ukraine's side? And that's difficult because India gets a lot of its energy from Russia. And at the time, Narendra Modi, the prime minister, said, we are not neutral, but we have strategic autonomy, meaning that they kind of change their strategy based on what they need at the time. They said that back in 2022, and other countries have followed. The Europeans are embracing strategic autonomy. Even Mark Carney has said that strategic autonomy is the way to go. So I think India really has no choice. They need to keep alliances with Iran. That's where they get oil from. They need to keep alliances with Russia. But then they also need to ship products outside of their borders. And so they need to maintain their close ties with Western countries as well that are going to buy products that are made in India. So they're just a great example of a country that cannot afford to position itself either to one side or another when it comes to the US or China, or the United States and Iran, the United States and Russia. It's kind of sitting in the middle.
We're going to move on to talking a little bit about the American dream. Barbara from California has sent us this.
Hi, my name is Barbara Jovanovic. I'm from Novi Sad, Serbia. I grew up and finished my education there, and my family still lives there, so I visit frequently. I never imagined that I would move to the U.S. I don't think that was my plan. But yeah, immigrating to the United States has obviously opened up a world of opportunities I never would have had in my home country. This is still very much the land of opportunities. I deeply appreciate the idea that if you believe in yourself and you work hard, you can make a positive future for yourself and your family. And I feel like the US really puts that at the forefront. So, yeah, that's me. Thanks for listening.
Now, we had a similar message from our listener, Alexandra, who emigrated to the United States from Ukraine, and also from Diana, who arrived in the US from Colombia. And she said this to us. She said, my family moved to the United States in 1987, which is the summer I turned 13. We left Colombia due to insecurity the country was going through at the moment. At that moment, my parents were the victims of kidnapping by the FARC in 1985. The US offered my husband and I the promise that if we worked hard, we would live comfortably. We did, and now enjoy a comfortable life thanks to the opportunities offered and accepted. Jeremy, you've reported, as we've already discussed, from unstable places all over the world, conflict zones. What does the United States mean to people in those places that you visited?
Generally, in the places where I have worked over the last 30 or 40 years, in many of those places, the Americans were not seen as a positive force because American intervention had had terrible consequences. I've spent many years reporting from different countries in the Middle East. Of course, there are other countries where the Americans were seen as absolutely vital. I spent a lot of time. I lived in Israel for 5 years in the 90s. And there, America, as it has been until really very recently, was seen as the absolute reliable ally. Now, as for the American dream, yeah, of course, America's always been a magnet for immigrants, but also for those people who are well established in the country. One of America's big problems now, and I think it's impacting actually the debates about the potential foreign policy in the next 5 or 10 years, is the dissatisfaction with the fact that many people in the United States no longer feel that dream is open to them, that they are concerned that their kids won't have the standard of living that they had. And the sort of foreign policy corollary of that is the way in which people are questioning being the global policeman, intervening around the place, having huge and very costly military commitments in places which on the face of it are not directly impacting on whether or not Americans are safe, but it's still costing them a hell of a lot of money at a time when a lot of people are thinking, well, we could do some of that money back here, thanks. So, it's always the case that foreign policy is an extension of domestic issues, and America is no exception in that sort of sense.
You said that a lot of the places you've covered are places where the reputation of the United States is not necessarily that strong. Having said that, Asma did this incredible interview in our episode earlier this week with a Somali American called Abdi. Somalia is a country which has had a complicated relationship with the United States. It was the Battle of Mogadishu in the early 90s. Abdi talks about the first time he saw these American soldiers arriving in Somalia, and giving him this food, which he thought was incredibly tasty, this jam, and he thought they all looked like Rambo, and he thought, I want to go to the United States. It looks incredible. Is that rare in your travels?
Well, I was in Mogadishu actually in the early 1990s.
Of course you were.
Look, of course, when people turn up like that, those sorts of scenes were replicated in Europe in 1944 and 1945. GIs arriving and giving people, chewing gum and candy and whatever else they had to chuck out of their cigarettes, probably in those days. No, look. Don't get the impression that I think that people around the world, many of them, do not admire the Americans, but the image of America that I think still a lot of Americans might actually have in their heads as essentially a country that wants to do good around the world, that is not shared in many, many countries, and also in places which have traditionally pretty much liked America, like this country, the UK. A lot of people don't think that anymore.
We want to end with a question from listener Moacir in Brazil. And let's hear what his question was.
Hello there. I am Moacir Sena from Sao Paulo, Brazil. I was born in Brazil, but all my life I've loved and admired and respected America for its values, for its history, for the concept of freedom and the search, the pursuit for happiness in a way that it's like the American dream. However, I've noticed that over the past 50 years, America has lost its way in really upholding freedom and upholding values of respect and mutual growth and development. So my question is, has America reached its top, its apex, and now is it in its decline? Let's hope that it's not, because it still is a light shining on the top of a hill. Thank you so much. Happy birthday, America.
Thank you for the birthday wishes. I'd love to hear from both of you, Jeremy and Celia. Why don't we start with you, Jeremy?
Well, what we've just heard is the classic expression of admiration for American exceptionalism, that it's the shining light on the hill that everybody aspires to, that will stand for liberty, freedom. But look, here's another way of putting it, if I want to be devil's advocate for a moment. The founding fathers were slave owners. There was a civil war over slavery in the 19th century. In the years after that, even though slavery was no more, the effective enslavement of many African Americans continued. Race is still a huge fault line down the center of the country. There are millions and millions of people in America who don't have decent health care, who don't have much of a safety net of the kind that we would expect to have in Europe if things go wrong for them. And abroad, America seems to be in a state of perpetual warfare with a lot of countries at the moment. So it was interesting in the question as I was listening to it, the sense that it's his impression was that what seemed great half a century ago might not be so great now. But maybe the answer is people are just using a bit more clarity. And the fact is, maybe America isn't exceptional. Maybe America is just a massive imperial power which works in the way that imperial powers have worked since the dawn of time. And there have been many, many empires going back way beyond the Romans in the course of human history. And yeah, the 20th century was known as by many as the American century. I don't think anyone is going to say right now that the 21st century is also going to be the American century. So I would say that while it was a great part of America's self-image and the impression that many people had of the country, that it stood for all these things, in fact, if you just, look under the stone a little bit, what was happening at home in the States as well as what happened abroad, things were never perfect, even though people inside their own heads and in the things that they said believed that they were. I'm sounding like a real America skeptic. I'm not. I think it's a great country. I think America was really important for me in my own life. But I think you need to look at it with some clarity. That's all I'm saying.
Can I just say, as an American, I find that one of the things that is so powerful about the United States is you're right. Those ideals, I think many of us are clear-eyed that we know the faults of some of the founding fathers. I do think increasingly in the United States, we have had really honest conversations about, did we actually uphold these ideals? No, maybe not historically over the decades. But I think the appeal of it was that we had these ideals. And so few nations have these founding ideals that they theoretically strive towards. And I find that really, really beautiful. It is aspirational. I get that totally. But I think that is what the allure is for so many people about the United States.
I don't want to knock America too much, but I think it's good that countries recognize the faults that they have, of course. And I've heard people in this country saying that actually the problem that we've got is that America had our revolution. The people who should have had a revolution in this country went to America to have it.
I mean, listening to Jeremy and also to our Brazilian contributor who asked the question. I mean, I think this idea of, an American century, or this idea that the United States is on this kind of continual upward trajectory, it is a bit. It's simplistic, as Jeremy said. Every country has a complicated past or decades of turbulence, and then they overcome those decades. If you look back through history, I mean, China's the same thing. I'm asked repeatedly, is this going to be the Chinese century? Is this the century where China can kind of vault to the top and the United States is kind of withers away? And my answer is continually, well, China has huge domestic problems when you peel back the layers. The economy is really struggling. There are thousands of protests every year because of unpaid wages or real estate deals gone bad, or it's an aging country. It might age out before it ever becomes a great country because there just simply aren't enough babies being born. That's a very real threat. So I guess when we think about, one superpower that was kind of a glittering example of continual development, well, you only have to look, behind the scenes to kind of really uncover these pictures within the United States of gun violence and racial issues. Those are just as true at a time when we thought that America was really the only superpower.
Can I just interject with just one last thing before we close? Hydration breaks. At the World Cup, this idea that instead of having a game of two halves, which football, as we call it, has always been, it's now becoming, thanks to hydration breaks in the United States, and I suppose by extension in Canada and Mexico, I suppose they're having them there too, a game of quarters. And that's why people, if you listen to the football coverage over here, people are grumbling about hydration breaks and saying it's just for American TV advertising. Look what they're doing to our beloved game.
Well, Jeremy, we were talking about whether or not we were going to do an episode of The Global Story about hydration breaks, but now we don't need to. So thank you so much for doing that.
I said it all.
Well, I think where we land here is that nothing is all good and nothing is all bad. My feelings about the United States are it's impossible to dislike or not. It's impossible not to love a place that gave us the song September by Earth, Wind and Fire, which in all impartiality is the happiest song ever created. And a place that it came from cannot be bad. That's my opinion. Thank you so much, guys. It's been great fun to have you with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was Celia Hatton, host of the Global News Podcast, with Jeremy Bowen, the BBC's international editor. Thank you so much to everyone who wrote into us. We're sorry we couldn't include every question, but know that we do read every one of your emails and we always appreciate hearing from you. So keep sending us your thoughts and ideas on theglobalstory@bbc.com.
And a reminder that The Global Story is also available as a podcast. So if you liked today's show, you can find more from us by just searching for The Global Story wherever you listen. And that's it for today's show. Thanks as always for tuning in.
Have a great weekend. We'll see you next week. Cheerio.